Good day, and welcome to Comcast Channel 977's This Week at the Lake. I'm your host, Jay Brown, and we're broadcasting from the High and Muriel Badler studio in the Lake Monticello Clubhouse. Today's subject is the fisheries program at the lake, and I have as a very special guest Ted McCranzy, who is an avid fisherman and also a member of the Watershed Management Committee. And Ted, welcome.
Good to see you,
and Happy New Year.
Thank you very much.
Get over that cold.
Yeah, right.
Ted, thanks for coming in, and tell us a little bit about your fishing experience. How long have you been a fisherman?
Most of my life, Jay. I was born and raised in California, and I grew up fishing for trout in the rivers of California and streams in the mountains and so forth. And when we moved to Virginia back in 1981, I laid the fly rods aside and learned how to fish for bass here in Virginia. So I've been fishing ever since.
You have, okay. And did you live in California before you came here?
We did, yeah. I joined IBM in California. We lived there about 8 years, and then I got a promotion to the DC area, and we lived there since 1981, and then moved here about 9.5 years ago.
Okay. Now, to the audience out there, Ted is also known as the spearhead for the community fishing pier at Tufton Lake. Ted not only came up with the idea, but he put together a fundraising plan and a group of volunteers to build that lovely pier out there that is home to children trying to catch bluegill, and to people who are handicapped, and for people who just want to go out there and sit and look at the sunset and have a nice time. Ted, thanks again for doing that.
It was my pleasure. It was a real work of love.
Well, you did it well. You did it well. Now, I understand that the LMOA board and the management have approved a plan to renovate or to improve the quality and the quantity of the fish in the lake. Can you tell us something about that plan?
Yes, I think it probably is worthwhile to go back a little bit into the history of how we got here. And basically it started with anecdotal comments from many fishermen at the lake saying that they thought that the fishing had declined in recent years. And so we started gathering statistics on the average size fish caught, particularly at the Thursday night bass tournaments, because they were well regulated and the fish are weighed and so forth. And so we kept those records for several years. And what we discovered was that the average size of bass has been declining very seriously since about 2006. In fact, I think we have a visual that will show that that's the one I want, yeah. That the average size fish has declined by about 45% in the last 6 years.
Wow.
And that rather precipitous drop, it was sort of the canary in the mine, if you will. It was the alert that said, hey, something is going on, we're not sure what. It may be more general than simply the bass. And so we started lobbying to have some studies done by professional fisheries biologists, which finally came to fruition last spring when a consultant by the name of Solitude Lake Management came in with an electrofishing project where they actually stunned the fish in the lake, collected them, gathered statistics on their size, the species of fish and so forth, released them later. The stunning process doesn't kill them, it just stuns them. And put together some statistics, and some of them were rather alarming. If we can take a look at the next slide, what their studies indicated was that the ratio of bass to bluegill in the lake at Lake Monticello is 2 bass for every bluegill. Now that's a little concerning. It's more than a little concerning. It's very concerning when you consider that the optimum food fish for a bass is a bluegill.
Right.
So it'd be rather like trying to raise cattle in a farm that had no hay or no feed for them, and that's essentially the situation we were in. If you take a look at the next slide, you'll see that a more desirable ratio is approximately 1 bass for every 20 to 40 bluegill. So you basically want to outnumber the bass with lots and lots of bluegill, and that's just the opposite.
So you've got to add bluegills in the form of minnows to junior juvenile fish or whatever.
That's part of the program. The real question is, how do we get here?
Yeah.
Why are we in this situation? And what the biologists tell us is the fundamental problem with Lake Monticello is it's very low in nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus in particular, and it also has rather low alkalinity. Those three water chemistry qualities, if you will, sort of prevent the growth of the kind of plankton and plant life that are necessary for a flourishing fishery. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that in a low nutrient lake, you tend not to have much algae. And so the water is relatively clear. And from a boater and a swimmer standpoint, it's not a bad situation.
But you've got to worry about becoming just one giant swimming pool.
That's right.
Right.
The issue here is to try to achieve a balance where we have a wonderful fishery as well as a wonderful boating and swimming environment. And I think we can do that. And our plan is laid out to try to accomplish that.
Okay. Here's basically the bullet points on the 5-year plan.
Yeah, these are basically the highlights of the plan. Let me quickly go through them, and we can discuss some of the issues as we go through the discussion. The first issue that is quite self-evident, I think, from those graphs we showed, is to reduce the number of bass in the lake temporarily, and I want to emphasize temporarily. The process of culling or removing fish that are in the 11 to 14 inch range means...
Why that range? What?
Well, that's where the majority of the bass are in this lake. They tend to be rather stunted, which means they don't grow to full length, and they also don't put a lot of weight on. And so what we want to do is reduce the number of mouths to feed, first of all, and that's this culling process. The second is we obviously want to stock bluegill. Now, you mentioned in your introduction that we were going to stock minnows and smaller bluegill. Actually, no. Actually, what we're going to do is stock larger bluegill, perhaps those almost the size of your hand, so that they're not immediately eaten by the bass that are left.
Ah.
What we want the bluegill to do is to flourish.
Do the children want to watch this program? Or?
Well,
those are the fish they catch off the end of the community pier.
That's right. And we don't want to discourage people necessarily from catching the bluegill, but we'd like to encourage them to return them to the water. Yeah. Whereas we'd like them to catch and keep bass, at least for a temporary period during this process of rebalancing the fishery. Now, the bluegill we're going to put in are big enough to spawn quickly, and their offspring will now multiply in large numbers to help rebalance the ratio of fish in the lake.
I think part of one of the previous programs that was many years ago, or a few years back, was that they were buying small bluegills, minnows, putting them in there, they'd be eaten up immediately, and then what did they do? Kind of thing.
That's right, and that turns out to be not a very efficient way to feed a population of bass. I did some arithmetic on doing exactly that. What if we were to add minnows to the lake in small numbers? Is that a cost-effective way to put weight on fish? It turns out it's not. Because the smallness of the minnows and the cost of raising them, the cost of bringing them in and putting them into the water, it actually costs $500 in feeder fish to put 1 pound on one bass if you throw minnows directly from the hatchery in the lake.
Wow.
They are that expensive. There is so little protein in each one of them that for each one that's gobbled, the bass doesn't put on a lot of weight. Although we did that because it's simple, it's easy, but it's really a stopgap measure.
So the large bass or the medium-sized bass are really the predator fish in the lake. They eat the bluegills. They eat also vegetable material too.
Not so much vegetable material, but there are other species of fish in the lake which they also eat.
Well,
Gizzard shad is one.
That was my question. Are there species in the lake that might have an impact on the planned restoration?
Very definitely. I mentioned at the outset that a desirable feeding strategy is for bass to eat bluegill. Bass grow to large sizes when they're in a situation where they can be ambush predators. Basically, they want to hide out in some place, a wood of some sort, bushes, underwater, and so forth, and they want to attack passerby bluegill. Mm-hmm. That takes rather a low amount of energy from the bass, and it's a rather efficient way for them to feed and to grow. Mm-hmm. Now, there are other species of fish in the lake, notably the gizzard shad, which is a small fish that does not eat conventional food, but it seines plankton from the lake, much like a whale seines krill from the ocean. They don't eat large items, but they seine the plankton from the water. Now, so what? Well, the so what is you can't catch readily a gizzard shad because they won't eat bait on a hook.
Right.
They don't strike at lures. They seine the water. When they're very young, they make fairly good bass food. The problem is that they grow very quickly, and when they grow quickly, they get too big to be eaten by the bass, but they're still effectively seining the plankton out of the water. What does that do? It reduces the food for the immature bluegills. Okay. So in effect, what the gizzard shad do is they very rapidly become too big to be eaten by the bass. However, they continue to strain nutrients out of the water, nutrients that could otherwise be used to feed the bluegill. Okay. So gizzard shad is one of the varieties of fish that we would like to remove from the lake because in effect they're a nuisance.
How would you remove those?
Well, since you can't do very well catching them with a hook and line, there's basically three strategies. One is you could poison the entire lake, which of course is
I don't like that.
Nobody wants to do that. The other thing is you could drain the entire lake, which nobody wants to do either. No. So the third way to get them out of the lake is to seine them out with a large gill net. Yep. And our plan right now is to purchase some gill nets, and then during the spring, when the shad come into the shallows in the evening, up into the rocky areas such as along the dam, they concentrate themselves in rather large quantities. And our hope is that by using gill nets, we can seine out large quantities of them. Now, we'll never get rid of all of them that way, but we can reduce their numbers, therefore reduce the pressure on the food for the smaller bluegill, and essentially remove a nuisance species that isn't much good for human consumption or for sport.
Now, is it the shad that's neutered, or it can't prolong?
Unfortunately, no. The shad are very prolific. If you've ever been out on the lake during the late spring, early summer, early in the morning, you can oftentimes see bass and/or white perch feeding on the surface, splashing the surface. What they're doing is they're herding and attacking large schools of gizzard shad. Now, at that point, the gizzard shad are very young. They were just spawned a month or two earlier, and so they may only be an inch, maybe 2 inches long, and so they make fine bass food at that time. But the problem is that the bass use a tremendous amount of energy to corral those fish, and it's not an efficient way for them to put weight on.
In addition to bass eating bluegills, you obviously have a program for feeding and restoring some of the natural nutrients in the lake. Can you tell us? I think we've got a couple of. It's not just fish. Fish in there.
Jay, before we move on, there's a couple of things that I'd like to mention about the strategy. One of them was to remove the bass, and we talked about that. Stocking bluegill is another one, but stocking bluegill by itself is no good if we don't provide places for the young bluegill to hide out.
Right,
and so we're going to put habitat in various places. And because the lake is low in nutrients, we need to supplement the lack of nutrients. Now, one way would be to literally put nitrogen and phosphorus in the lake. As we probably all know, that's not very good for the health of Chesapeake Bay.
Right.
Conservationists are trying to reduce the flow of fertilizer into Chesapeake and other waters in general. We happen to be in a very unusual situation of not having a lot of fertilizer in our lake.
Right.
But we don't want to add it artificially. There's too much risk, and by the way, it's also illegal for the conservation reasons. Okay. So what we want to do is supplement that by putting in artificial fish feeders that will feed the bluegill to promote their growth and indirectly then feed the bass on their offspring. Now, one of the other things we'd like to do is to put in shoreline plants along the shore in the lake to provide additional places for the young bluegill to seek refuge.
We've got a slide of one of those. Do you want me to show the slide?
We do have some slides of that. Let me just point out that one of the things people are very concerned about when we talk about shoreline plants, particularly those who have lived at the lake for a long time, is I don't want you to recreate the problem we had with the hydrilla. And if you've lived at the lake long enough to have experienced the hydrilla, you know that that plant life, lake weed of various sorts, creates an impenetrable mat that creates a problem for boaters, for swimmers. It's a nice environment for fishermen because it concentrates the fish and it gives the fish forage a place to hang out. But it's not a very good place for boaters and swimmers. So no, the shoreline plants we are talking about are not hydrilla. They're not invasive. They're a native plant, and they're the ones.
And we're going to get to that native plant in a moment, aren't we?
We'll have
yes,
a
right. We had, and in addition to these artificial habitats, now what happens? Does matter grow up around these structures, and then they become a hiding place and a natural feeding place for fish?
Exactly. Let's take a look. Here's an example of one type of artificial habitat that we're looking at very seriously right now. Yeah. It's made by a company called Mossback, and essentially what it is, it's a PVC tube with slots cut in it, and then you put these arms into it to create kind of a tree-like structure. Now the arms have a rough surface on them so that they promote the growth of algae and other kinds of plankton like animals, and that provides a shelter for the young bluegill. Bass, interestingly enough, do not like to go into an area where there's a lot of branches to seek their food. And the reason is they don't want to touch up against something. Right. Because if they do, it scrapes a protective coating off their skin.
What happened? We used to throw Christmas trees in there as a, before this kind of program.
And putting Christmas trees in is a wonderful idea. The issue with Christmas trees is, number one, you have to put a lot of them in.
Right.
In the past, we put maybe 5, 6, 7 of them in a bunch. We're talking about 25, 30, 100 of them in a forest, basically,
right,
to be really effective. The second thing is that they deteriorate in about 5 years, and it has to be done again. Right. This process is labor intensive, and so what we'd like to be able to do is to put habitat underwater where it's out of the way of boats and swimmers in such a place that it doesn't create a problem for other users of the lake. And we'd like it to be a one-time proposition where we put it in one time and it stays there forever so we don't have to continually maintain it.
Okay. Now,
so we're looking at man-made structure.
All right. And speaking of man-made structures, we have a feeding machine that is going to be placed in about, I understand, about 55 places around the lake. And you're looking for volunteer homes.
We are.
To set these up on the lake and to help refill them when they need to. I think they need to be refilled once or twice a year.
That's right.
And tell us a bit about what kind of food you have here, how you will disperse it to the lake, and so on.
Good question. Here are photographs of two different types of fish feeders. They're very similar. They vary basically in terms of their capacity, how much feed you can put in them. They're typically solar powered. They have timers in them, and they have distribution systems that automatically disperse the food. Yep. So that you set the timer so that the feeder might disperse 3 seconds worth of food twice a day. And it essentially sprays it out over an area on the water. The fish get accustomed to that process, and they hear the food hit the water, and it will attract them. They'll eat the fish food, and in that way, we hope to use these feeders to compensate for the low nutritional value of the lake itself.
And you're looking for a lot of volunteers to do this. And,
we are. We're looking for volunteers to do a number of things. First of all, to volunteer their waterfront property.
Yeah.
Secondly, the feeders will hold enough food to feed for about half the feeding period during a year. So we anticipate that we'll have to stock the feeders probably twice a year. Which will mean carrying food out to them and replenishing the hoppers. Now, it's a fair amount of food. Each of these feeders will probably use somewhere around 400 pounds of food a year.
Wow.
So it's a significant amount of food.
Yep. Okay. Let's see what the next slide shows us. This is instead of hydrilla, or the kind of grass that you don't want growing up, especially if you're a boater or up the side of your dock. You are going with something called Pickerel Rush, and these have to be, I understand, hand-planted? Tell us a bit about that program.
Yes. The Pickerel Rush as the slide indicates, is not invasive. It's a native plant of this part of the world. It's shallow water, and what I mean by that is the biologists tell us that it doesn't grow in water that's deeper than 18 inches. So it's intended to be planted along the shoreline, and it's purchased in containers, much like you'd purchase a house plant. It's in a pot.
Yeah.
It's a small plant, and it literally has to be taken out of the pot and planted in the waterfront area to be installed. And so there's another opportunity for volunteers to help us plant that material. Now, I want to caution folks that we are not simply willy-nilly going to throw plants all around the lake. We're going to start on a very small level this first year in Jackson Cove, and we're going to pick a few waterfront homes where we can plant some of these plants and observe them for a while. We want to be sure that they don't create an invasion problem. Even all the literature says they won't.
Don't mention that word.
No.
Right.
No.
Okay.
The second is we want to make sure that they will survive. While the grass carp, which many people have commented on from time to time, and I think we'll spend a minute talking about them in a bit, fed on the hydrilla, grass carp do not feed on plants such as pickerel rush.
So bass, and I take it pickerel feed on this, do they?
That's
I know
good.
we have no pickerel.
We
but
do. Actually,
you're calling it Pickerel Rush for some
well,
reason.
they call it pickerel rush, but I think it's mostly because pickerel like to hang out in plant life like this.
Oh, I see.
The concern that I do have about them is how resistant they will be to muskrats. And so
we have a muskrat program, elimination program at the lake, don't we?
We do.
Yeah.
We do. So one of the things we want to do is when we put them in, we want to observe and see whether the muskrats will leave them alone, or if they're going to be such a significant problem, it's not going to work. So that's why we're going to do it on kind of a limited basis this first year and see how it works. And if it's successful, then we hope to proliferate it.
Okay. One more question before we come to a bit of a break. Are the silts, is the silt being deposited in the lagoons and arms of the lake? It's fairly excessive, and I know the dredging program is fairly slow. Is this going to impede the progress of setting up fisheries for?
I don't think it will impede it. I heard an interesting statistic the other day, and that is that our dredging program is removing roughly is actually removing more silt than is entering the lake each year. Now, I don't have any evidence myself, but I've heard that in conversations. A couple of observations about that. We've heard anecdotally that coves that have been recently dredged of the silt are starting to show fish hatcheries. We're starting to see places where bluegill will spawn and bass will spawn in water that previously had silt in it. So I think your comment is apt. If we can get the silt out of the headwaters, the upper ends of coves, it probably will help the breeding process for the fish. My particular objective and our particular objective doesn't include the silt removal process. Right. There are others on our committee that are working on that.
Okay. Now, in case you've just tuned in, this is This Week of the Lake. I'm your host, Jay Brown, and today's very special guest is Ted McCranzy, and we're talking about the fish program. In other words, what to do about restocking the fish, making sure it just doesn't become a dead swimming pool. The livelier this lake can be, the better for all aspects. Back to you, Ted. And I think we've got some fish to show here.
We do.
We've got some pictures of fish, and I think that should be next on the clicker here. There you are. And you caught the one on the left. You may have caught the one on the right. Tell us about the one on the left.
Yeah, the one on the left is an extreme example of what we call a stunted bass. It is a bass that is older than it looks from its length perspective. They're stunted in the sense that because there's insufficient food, they haven't reached their full growth potential. The one on the left has a couple of characteristics that are alarming. One of the issues is look at the size of the head relative to the body. Mm-hmm. It's a rather large head and a rather short body. The other characteristic is the sunken belly on it.
Yeah.
That's an indication of a starved bass. Now, I want to emphasize this is not typical of the bass that are in the lake, but it is a an extreme example of what happens when a bass doesn't have enough to eat.
Right.
The one on the right is a more normal shaped bass. A healthy bass is normally shaped like a football, or even more, with even a distended tummy from lots of food.
Yeah.
But I would call the one on the right-hand side a healthy appearing largemouth. One of the things that characterizes them, if you're not familiar with fish, is the green line that runs from roughly their eye back to the end of their tail.
Okay.
That's a largemouth.
Did you catch
bass.
the one on the right too?
I caught them both, yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. White perch. Tell us about white perch.
White perch are an interesting story at the lake. I hadn't seen them until recently, and I'm not sure how long they've actually been in the lake. White perch are game fish. They compete with the bass for the same kind of food. They will eat small bluegill. They will eat the gizzard shad. Sometimes when you see fish breaking on the surface, they're not all bass. In many cases, there's schools of these white perch. They're a little bit smaller than a bass. One of the characteristics that is interesting about a white perch is they're supposed to be very good to eat. I've never caught enough of them myself to eat them.
I caught perch as a kid. I don't know if they were white, but there's different kinds of perch, aren't there?
Certainly,
Yeah,
certainly.
but they were very good.
Yep.
Bony, but good to eat.
Right.
Right.
And this fellow is good to eat. The problem I've always had is I've never been able to catch many of them. I think the people that are successful are using smaller lures than the typical bass fisherman uses.
I see.
Smaller minnow-like lures. The characteristic of the white perch that is most important from the fishery standpoint is they compete with the bass for the same food.
Okay.
So
what is the committee's view on this? Are you trying to suppress the growth of these fish, or are you just leaving them alone?
we consider them to be a nuisance fish. And what we are going to do is encourage people to catch and keep them.
Yeah.
As I say, they're very good to eat. I don't happen to be very good at catching them, but for those who are, by all means catch them and keep as many as you can. We expect that we'll probably catch some white perch when we start gill netting the gizzard shad as well.
Okay. Speaking of gizzard shad, I think we've got them coming up. There's a gizzard shad.
There's a gizzard shad, and that didn't actually come from this lake. It's a photograph of somewhere else, but
Right.
It illustrates the problem with the gizzard shad. They get very large very quickly. In fact, we've had comments from fishermen at the lake that they've seen them in the 17 to 18 inch category.
Yeah.
So they very rapidly get too big to be consumed as fish food, but they do compete with the bluegill because they seine the microorganisms out of the lake.
Okay.
We'd like to get rid of them.
And here, oh, this is the bluegill. Okay. Sunfish, right.
This is a sunfish, and we actually have a few different varieties of sunfish in the lake, but most of us just call them bluegill. They are probably the most common fish sought by children. They're easy to catch generally. They're fun to watch. They're a great fight. They're good to eat, and they form the basis of the food chain for the bass, or we'd like them to. So we want to increase their population, and we're going to take some very definitive action.
Would that be the one we're looking at on the screen right now? Would that be the size of bluegill you would be adding, or is it a smaller fish?
That's about the size we will be adding. We'd like to put them in as large as we can get. Unfortunately, when you buy fish from a hatchery, the bigger the fish, the more expensive they get. So our budget will allow us to buy bluegill up to about maybe 5 inches in size. The good news is they spawn several times a year at that size, so they'll produce lots of little ones.
Good. And here we have, believe it or not, another fish that's in the lake. That's a big fish. Now that's the grass carp that was originally brought in here to eat the hydrilla, right?
That's exactly
to clear,
right.
Make a nice dock front for all the people.
That's right.
We're complaining about the grass. Right?
That's absolutely right. Grass carp were planted here over several years. I think the last time they were actually put in the lake were, if memory serves, I think it was 2004. They get to be huge, and you can see in this photograph that's a big fish. My understanding is they get up to around 40 pounds, or can get that big. The important thing to know about grass carp is that they are sterile.
Yeah.
They do not reproduce. Once you put them in the lake, they stay in the lake until they die off. Their primary food is vegetation, but they're not exclusively vegetarian. They probably accounted for the elimination of the hydrilla. And for those that love the hydrilla because what it did for bass fishing, really don't like the grass carp very much. But
Right.
what I have to say to those folks is that the grass carp, because they don't reproduce, their time is limited in the lake.
Yeah.
The life expectancy for a grass carp is about 17 years. Sometimes lakefront owners will see schools of these grass carp in the coves, particularly during the summer. They'll bask in the shallow water, and they appear like big, huge submarines.
Right.
And they're very intimidating if you've never seen them, and particularly if you're a bass fisherman and you're quietly fishing along somewhere and you suddenly startle a school of them, the whole cove will erupt as they scurry.
I've seen that, yeah. Right.
So they're very impressive fish. They're huge. They're not easily caught. They can be caught, and I've caught several.
Online with
yes.
a hook, yeah.
Yeah, and you're really in for a battle if you hook one.
I bet you are. These are Eastern Europe, I believe, and Asia eat these fish quite regularly.
The Europeans eat carp. Now, there's a couple of different kinds of carp. There's the common carp that you find in rivers and so forth that are not sterile, and then there are these called, I think scientifically they're called amurs, A-M-U-R-S. They were bred particularly to control vegetation in lake waters. They can be eaten. I was eating carp soup in Eastern Europe last spring. So in parts of the world, they're valued for meat.
Right.
Not so much in this country.
I bet.
Yeah.
Now, are there any new varieties of fish that can be added that you would like to add that is being talked about being added? I'm thinking primarily about trout and pickerel.
It turns out we do have chain pickerel in the lake in relatively small numbers. The fish that we looked at in our diagrams a little while ago are simply the most common fish that are in the lake, but there's a wide variety of additional species. Chain pickerel is one, not in great numbers, but I've caught a few. And when we did the study earlier in the year, the electrofishing, they found some chain pickerel as well.
Mm-hmm.
Trout, the lakes in the Piedmont area in Virginia are probably too warm to host trout in large quantities. And they would probably be eaten by the bass even if they were.
Oh, really?
In California, some of the best bass fishing, the largest bass, are caught in lakes that also host trout.
Yeah.
And the reason is because the trout end up being bass food. In fact, you can buy bass lures in California that look like
large trout.
Yeah.
Okay.
So trout probably not. Now there has been some discussion among the interested people that I've talked about this with, who are interested in putting striped bass in the lake. Now there's striped bass in Lake Anna. There's striped bass down in...
also called rockfish, right?
Also called rockfish out in the saltwater, yeah. It's an interesting possibility. We've asked the freshwater biologists if they think that would be a good idea. They kind of hesitate because they don't think that the chemical composition of the water would be well suited to them. The other issue is they do not spawn in small freshwater lakes. Even Lake Anna has to repopulate the population there. They're not naturally spawning there. They have been proposed as a possible measure to control the gizzard shad, and it may turn out to be an excellent idea. But right now, the biologists are saying we don't think so, but I don't think the issue's closed on striped bass yet.
Okay. Now, the program, the 5-year program, which I would imagine you would hope would be renewed for another 5 years, an ongoing program, but to get it started anyway, would be for the first 5 years and then assess it to see whether you wanted to go on. Most of your help is going to come from volunteers, not from paid people? And
yes.
you really are in the need for volunteers.
We are. We're using a combination of professional guidance and volunteer helping hands. We have contracted with Solitude Lake Management. When I say we, I mean LMOA, has contracted with Solitude Lake Management to provide oversight and monitoring of our activities. Part of the process is we intend to have them come back every 2 years and do another electrofishing study to measure our progress as we try to rebalance the lake. We're going to have visits from them probably on a monthly basis to give us advice and guidance as to how we should proceed. but the basic work is going to be done by volunteers to try to keep the price down. And so we're looking for volunteers. That's a very important part of our program. And we're looking for volunteers in at least two different capacities. First is if you are interested in installing a fish feeder on your shoreline, habitat under your dock, or possibly plant life along your shoreline, then I would call you a willing waterfront homeowner.
Right.
I'm interested in knowing who you are. I'm interested in knowing where you live, and I'd like to be able to contact you when the time comes.
And speaking of contacting, I think we have a slide that takes us there.
We do. It's up right now. We have established an email address for those interested in volunteering. It's fishlmoa@gmail.com. Not only are we interested in finding out willing homeowners, but we're also trying to identify those that are willing to lend a hand when it comes time to actually putting the habitat in, installing the fish feeders, stocking them, and putting the plants in the shoreline. Either type of individual can contact us by sending an email to that email address, and we'll be happy to put you on our mailing list and keep you in the loop in terms of what we're doing.
Okay.
And thank you very much for your help.
Right. When will this program begin, Ted?
It has started. We started, our first formal activity was at the Newcomers and Old Friends meeting this last Sunday. We currently have, I believe it's 21 volunteers to lend a helping hand, and we have 24 homeowners who have signed up to say, yes, you can.
No, so you're nearly halfway there on the homeowners.
On the homeowners, let's talk about that a minute. We have 54 feeders, but we're going to put underdock habitat and plants at a lot more homes than that. Right. So we can use as many homeowner volunteers as we can get who are located on the lake. And in terms of volunteers to do the work, when we constructed the fishing pier, I had a list of volunteers of close to 80 people. Right. Now, on any one particular day, we maybe only had 10 to 12 show up. But that's the way it is with volunteers. Sure. So I will take every volunteer who's interested in working, put them on a mailing list. I'll send mailings out to tell people when we're doing stuff. And if we get 5-10% of the people on our list, I'll consider that to be successful. So we need a big list.
Well, with a person like you in charge, Ted, I feel confident that this is going to be done properly.
Thank you.
Now, is there any other thing that you would like to add on top of this before we close out?
Well, there is a couple things that we touched on but didn't spend much time with. Culling of the bass is an important issue. Probably the best way to remove the excess bass from the lake is to catch them with hook and line. Okay. It's the least expensive for the community to do it. Now, what it requires is, for those of you who are bass fishermen, it's going to require you to change your habits, because most sport bass fishermen today catch and release. Yeah. Unfortunately, in this situation, we need to have the fish removed from the lake. And so what we're going to ask is that those of you who are bass fishermen, please catch and keep your fish under 15
And they're
inches.
good eating, too, aren't they?
They're reasonably good eat. I think the smaller the better, actually. Right. But we want them taken out of the lake. Now, a lot of people object to the idea of killing fish for rebalancing purposes. So what we're working on is a program where you don't have to do that. We're working on a program to put live pens potentially near the marina, where when you catch your bass, you bring them to the pens, you put them in the pen, and then on a periodic basis, perhaps once every 2 to 3 weeks, the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries will come in with nets, net them out of the tanks or out of the holding pens, put them in the trucks, take them away for a conservation project that Virginia Game and Inland Fisheries are working on. So you don't have to kill the fish. We can donate them to a constructive conservation effort.
Okay.
So the issue I want to drive home is, for you bass fishermen, we're asking you to change your behavior for a while, catch and keep. And then later, down the line, what we intend to do is replace every one of those fish that was removed with a feeder trained bass. Right. What does that mean? It'll eat food out of the same feeders we're going to be feeding the bluegill with. Right. And our hope is that they will then grow, their offspring will be normal bass, and eventually we'll restore the lake to balance.
Good. Well, this brings a program to a close. You've been watching This Week at the Lake. I'm your host, Jay Brown, and today's subject has been the Fish Management Program, headed by people like Ted McCrancy, my very special guest. And he wants to hear from you, so you've already seen the slide with the way to get hold of him. It's by email. Now, this show will air first this coming Thursday, the 15th, at 7 o'clock, and then repeat at 8 o'clock at night. And then at 8:30 and 9:30 in the morning, and 7 and 8 o'clock at night through Thursday, the 22nd. You can also download it on YouTube. Just go into YouTube, put Lake Monticello Owners Association, and you'll see Ted and I talking there. There'll be a slide of us, and pick that up and make sure you look at it anytime you want at your own leisure. So until next time, and this is Jay Brown again, and keep watching. Watch every night. Goodbye.